Hey guys, this is Anthony Morganti from OnlinePhotographyTraining.com. Welcome to my video series, Learn Lightroom CC, also known as Lightroom in the Cloud. In this video, we're going to finally process an image in Lightroom CC. For this demonstration, I chose this image because quite obviously it needs a lot of processing. This video, though, is going to be a little bit more of an overview of the different processing tools and functions that are available in Lightroom CC. In subsequent videos, I'm going to get more specific about the different things you could do with these tools and functions. Now, once you've decided on the image you want to process, I've mentioned previously that all the processing tools are over here on the right-hand panel. If you click on the very top one, or even if you just hover over it, you'll see it says Edit. These are our edit tools. So we'll click on that, and when we do, you'll see a bunch of little tabs open up. Now, they're laid out with light at the top and geometry at the bottom. It's kind of implying you would start at the top and work your way down. You don't have to. You could jump around. As a matter of fact, I personally don't like to start with light right away. So I'm going to show you the way I kind of do things and explain why I do them the way I do them. Then hopefully you could take what I do and maybe take something someone else does and kind of come up with your own way of processing an image that works for you. Personally, I like to go right into optics and apply any lens corrections to the image, because quite often lens corrections will make an image a little brighter and or just change the image enough that if I go right into light and start adjusting the different light attributes of the image, when I come in here then and hit Enable Lens Profile or Lens Corrections, it's going to change it a little. So I'm going to do that first. So I'll just click the second checkbox, Enable Lens Corrections. And you can see when I do, it does make the outside a little bit lighter. There's before, there's after. So it does affect the light a little bit. Now, hopefully when you click that, it found the actual lens you're using. You can see right here, and if you don't see this box here, there's a little box to the right of where it says Enable Lens Corrections. That's an expose triangle. Just click on that, and you'll see these two sliders. Hopefully it found the lens you're using, and in this case it did. And if I click on that, an info box will pop up, and it's telling me my lens profile. It was a Nikon 24-70 f/2.8 lens, and it was the lens I used. So this is correct. So if it didn't find your lens, or if it found the wrong lens, you could come in here and drill down to try to find your lens. Now, if you're good to go, just click OK. Now, if for some reason it didn't find a lens, it doesn't have your lens in its database, you could come in here and move these sliders for either pincushion or barrel distortion with that slider, or lens vignetting with this slider, and hopefully basically correct your lens distortion by eye. Hopefully you don't have to do that. Now, above lens corrections, there's this remove chromatic aberration. Quite often with some lenses, particularly cheaper lenses that don't have those real expensive coatings on them, you'll get a little, it could be anything from a purple to magenta to green line, little line on edges between high contrast areas. For this image, if it had it, it would be in here. But typically, if you're using a better lens, you won't often see that. But it doesn't hurt to click that anyway, and that will help eliminate any of those little lines of chromatic aberration that may be in your image. Now, I'm done with optics. After I'm done there, what I often like to do is look at the white balance and adjust that. That isn't up at the top, that's down here in color. And you can see white balance is right there. And we're going to come back to this in a minute. I'll close that down. So we have white balance. In this case, I think it's okay. You could just come in and try different white balances for the image and see if there's one you like over a different one. The reason why I like to do this early in my processing is you could see it really does affect the light as well. So if I like fluorescent, I would do different light adjustments compared to if I did a shot, maybe. or daylight. So I'm going to leave it as shot, but just to give you an idea, that's why I do that. Now we could go up to light. Now, one thing I will say real quick, if you're using a computer with a smaller screen like a laptop or something, these sliders may be too big. They're taking up too much real estate on your screen. If that's the case, just right click to the right of any of the headings, either light, color, any of them. I'll right click next to light, and you'll see this little menu will pop up. We could reset that whole section, or you'll see down here it says normal layout and compact layout. Choose compact layout and it will make all those smaller, and hopefully it'll give you more screen to see your image as you're processing. Now in this case, I don't need that. I'm going to leave it on normal, and it's a little easier for you guys to see what I'm doing. So I'm going to close down color. We're going to work on light. Now, usually what I do is when I look at an image, I look what needs adjusting the most. And right away, my shadows in this image are very dark. So I'll jump right down to shadows and open those up by moving the slider to the right. And you can see that it opened up really nicely. Now, I'll go to highlights, and I want to bring those down because I want to try to bring out some rich colors in the highlights. So I'm going to pull those down, and I'm just eyeballing it just to see whether or not it looks right to me. Now we have a contrast slider. I usually would jump up there next and add contrast. And by the way, if you want to reset any slider, you could double click on the slider itself, or just hover over the name and you'll see it will turn into reset. You could reset that slider. Often I like to use the tone curve for contrast instead of the contrast slider. I could adjust the tone curve so the contrast is more to my liking, and I'm going to have a video in the future dedicated to just the tone curve so you could understand how powerful the tone curve is. For this demonstration, I'm just going to show you the tone curve real quick. It's hidden. If you look over here to light, you look to the right, you'll see this little box here, this little squiggly line. Click on that and the tone curve appears. Now, I'm just going to add quickly a little contrast to this image by using what's called the point curve. And again, I'm going to cover the point curve, or I'm going to cover the tone curve in depth in a future episode. So what I'm going to do to add this contrast is I'm going to put a point right in the middle. Then I'm going to go down here in this lower left-hand side, which represents the blacks and shadows, and I'm going to make those darker. And to do that, I'll put a point there, and I'll pull that down. If I pull it down, the blacks and shadows get darker. If I push it up, the blacks and shadows would get lighter. Now I want to pull it down a little bit, because really what contrast is, the dark parts are getting a little darker and the light parts are getting a little lighter, and that's how you're adding contrast to an image. Now I'll go up to the upper right-hand area of the curve, which represents the whites and highlights, and I'm going to put a point there, and I'm going to push this one up because I want the whites and highlights a little brighter. So that adds contrast to the image. Now I'll turn it off so you can see a before. There's before, and there's after. Before, after, and you can see it definitely added a lot of contrast to the image, particularly in the clouds. There's before, and there's after. So I'm done with the point curve. I could close it down by clicking on that little box right there. But I have some more sliders to work with here. Now, the exposure is okay. This is a sunset, and I want to bring out the rich colors, and I want the colors to be dark. So I really don't want to turn up exposure. To me, that's eliminating what I'm going for. You may want it brighter. If so, feel free. But I'm going to leave that dark. But what I am going to do is jump down here where it says whites and blacks. Now, there's an interesting way you could get a kind of automatic white point and an automatic black point. To do that, you would hold in your Alt or Option key. It's Alt if you have a PC, Option if you have a Mac. And when you hold that key in and click on whites, the entire screen will turn black. And what you'd normally like to do is move whites to the right until you see some colors coming through. Those colors represent clipping. Where it's blue, that's the blue channel clipping. Where it's green, that's the green channel clipping. If you see any red down there, there's a little bit down there, the red is the red channel clipping. Where it's white, that means all three channels are clipping. Usually we don't want clipping in our image, or we want limited clipping in our image, because when a color or a channel clips, that means you're losing all detail. There's no detail left. When you're clipping whites and you're clipping all three channels, you're basically going to have solid white there. There's not going to be any detail at all. So we'll back this off until all that goes away, and that means we'll have detail throughout all our highlights. Now in the case of this image, you'll notice down there towards the bottom, just right of the middle, there's a little spot there. That's the sun, and I won't worry about that clipping. I'm going to leave that alone. So that's fine, but everything else to me is adjusted the way I like it. Now some people like to adjust it slightly differently. They like a little bit of clipping, or they want really way no clipping at all, and they'll move this further to the left. Personally, I just bring it just enough so the clipping goes away. Now blacks, I'm a slightly different. Now I'm going to hold the Alt or Option key, and again it's Alt if you have PC, Option if you have a Mac, and when I click down on this and start to move it, the screen turns white. But we get those same colors coming through, red, green, and blue. Now I like the blacks on my images usually, at least on my landscape images, to clip a little bit. To me, that adds a little more visual depth, tonal depth to the image. So I let those clip a little bit. So I'll bring that down so I have some color coming through, and that's adjusted properly. Now, for me. Now, as far as this little trick of holding in the Alt or Option key, that also works with the highlights and shadows as well. If you want to do it there, you can. I don't personally, but you may be different. So I'm done with this light tab. So I'll close that down, and we'll move down to the color tab. Now we had this open a second ago when we were looking at white balance. Now you can come in and adjust white balance here if you'd like to again. You also could get the eyedropper. When you click on the tool, your cursor turns into this kind of bullseye eyedropper thing. And what you want to do is try to find somewhere in the image that is middle gray. And then you would click on it, and that would give you a white balance that is correct for the light that is in that scene. I happened to just actually accidentally clip there. I wasn't really paying attention to where I was clicking, and I kind of like that. So I'm going to leave that. But you could come in and use that eyedropper like I mentioned. When you're done with it, just click on that little eyedropper again, and you'll kind of store it away. And you can see now the white balance turn into a custom white balance. You also then could come in and just manually move the temp and tit sliders if you'd like to a value you like that works for you on your image. Now we have vibrance and saturation. They'll both either increase or decrease the color saturation of the image. For example, if I go to saturation, I take this all the way down, we'll have a black and white image. I'll reset it by double clicking right on the slider. Now the main difference between, there's really two main differences between vibrance and saturation. As you saw with saturation, it will affect every single color in the image. Also, if a color is already saturated and you keep moving this to the right, it's going to oversaturate the colors. So it will oversaturate, and it will affect every single color in the image. Vibrance, on the other hand, doesn't affect every single color. It tends to not affect reds and oranges quite as much. You can see there's a tiny bit of color still down there. So it doesn't affect reds and oranges as much. Also, as you move it to the right, it will bring colors to saturation, but won't oversaturate them, at least not that much. So that's where vibrance works well. Now, typically, you'd like to use a vibrance slider if you have a person in the scene, or even a portrait. Vibrance is a better choice because it doesn't affect reds and oranges as much. Skin tones won't be affected as much or as heavily as saturation. So typically, landscape image, I'll come in and I'll move saturation a little bit to the right. Now in the case of this, it's pretty colorful because of my choice of white balance. So I don't have to move saturation too much. Now you'll notice to the right of color, there's this little square. That means something's hidden there. If I click on that, this is the color mixer. This is a luminance. If you click there, color, hue, saturation, and luminance of the image. So I could come in here and adjust the individual luminance levels, because we're on luminance now, of the different colors. So if I want to make the yellows darker, I could move that up, make the yellows brighter, move that up. I'm not going to, obviously, but that gives you an idea. If you want to increase the saturation of a color, go to the saturation tab, and then you could come in and increase like the saturation of yellow or decrease the saturation of yellow. So whatever works for your specific image. Now this case, this image, it's really super colorful, and I'm not going to do anything with the color mixer in this demonstration, but I will in future videos. Now we're done with color for this image. I'm going to go down to effects. We have clarity, which is a mid-tone contrast, which gives the effect of making it look like your image is sharper. So I like to move that to the right. If you want to move it to the left and it kind of gives you this dreamy, ethereal look, go for it. But I'm going to move it to the right. If I go too far, it starts giving it that HDR kind of crunchy look that most of us don't like. So I'm going to leave it a little bit like that. I think that looks pretty good. Dehaze, often, especially with landscape images, you get a lot of haze in the shot. You move this to the right, it will help eliminate the haze. If you want to introduce haze to the shot, move it to the left. In this case, I'm leaving it at 0. Now, vignette. Do you want to add a white vignette to your image? Move it to the right. A dark vignette, move it to the left. Now, I'll just reset that temporarily. One thing, again, to always look out for when you're working with Lightroom CC is there's stuff that's stowed away and hidden. Now I mentioned we have these kind of squares that are often up here. We have this square here, and if I click on it, we're going to reveal split toning. Split toning allows you to give a color tone or tint to your highlights, and then a different color tone or tint to your shadows. And a lot of times we do this to give kind of a film look to our image or an old-time look to our image. I will have a video on split toning, but just know that it's there when you click on this. I'm not going to use it for this episode. But if you look down here, we have a little triangle to the right of vignette also. So that's implying that something's stowed away in here. So we'll click on that, and you can see there's a lot more sliders. So we have this white vignette if I move that to the right, dark vignette if we move it to the left. Let's use the white just so I could better demonstrate the other sliders. The first one is midpoint. If I move it out, it basically just draws it away from the center if I move it to the right. If I move it to the left, it just pushes it in towards the center. Roundness. Do you want, in this case, it's an oval vignette. And if I move it to the right, it's going to get more round. If I move it to the left, it'll get more rectangular. Okay. Feather, the feathering of the edge. If I move it to the right, it increases the feathering. If I move it to the left, it decreases the feathering. So now we have that real hard edge there. And in this case, if you move the vignette slider to the left, you can see highlights. It'll brighten up the highlights that are being darkened by the vignette. That's what that does. A lot of times the vignette will make it not look natural because you're darkening a highlight that goes from the middle of the image to the outside of the image. So typically you could take this slider then and brighten it up if you'd like. Now, for this demonstration, I think I'd like a little bit of a darker vignette, but not that much, just a little bit. So just like that. And I'd say I'm done with the effects tab or panel. Now, detail is sharpening. And I misspoke in a previous video. I mentioned that there was only a sharpening slider, when in fact we have these expose triangles, and I wasn't paying attention. So remember, I think you really always have to adjust sharpening with all the sliders. Move it to the right, you're going to increase the sharpening of your image. The radius is, and I'm going to have a video just on the detail panel because it's important to understand what all these sliders do. The radius is how far out from a high contrast edge do you want to sharpen, make it more contrasty is what actually sharpening does. If you move it to the left, it will pull that radius in. If you move it to the right, it's going to push it out. Sometimes it's hard pressed to see an effect here. When I'm moving it, you're actually seeing the grass and gravel area around the sculpture get lighter and darker. So I'll leave that at the default position. Now, the detail slider again is, if you move it to the right, you're going to really make it a little sharper. You're increasing that contrast. You're making it harder contrast and giving it more detail. Move it to the left and you'll kind of soften it a little bit. Masking is allowing you to mask out uniform areas where you don't need any sharpening. And you can move that to the right, or you could hold the Alt or Option key in again, and it's Alt if you have PC, Option if you have a Mac. And when you do, the screen turns white. Where it's white, that is being sharpened. As I move it to the right, you'll see some black come in. Where it's black, that's not being sharpened. So I can move that to the right. Now in this case, the sky, I'd like that all sharp. But often if you have especially like an expansive blue sky, if you sharpen it without masking, you'll start to get noise, because sharpening will really affect the noise in your image as well. And it will sharpen that noise, and you don't want it to. So you'd use masking to mask out the sky, and that's what that effectively does. Now below that is noise reduction. Typically, you'd like to do noise reduction first, then sharpening, because sharpening sharpens the noise, as I mentioned, and then it sometimes is harder to get rid of the noise. But as far as Lightroom is concerned, these three mini tabs, sharpening, noise reduction, and color noise reduction, all work together. So it really doesn't matter. Personally, I do like to use noise reduction or go into noise reduction first. And if you do, you'd probably want to zoom in a little to see the noise, and then move this slider to the right to get rid of the noise. And just eyeball it till you see the noise go away. Now, if you've gotten rid of the noise, but you're starting to see that you're losing some of your sharpening, some of the detail is being lost, you would go to this detail slider and move this to the right, and it will rescue some of that detail without reintroducing the noise. Also, contrast here helps it better produce a sharp image, even though you're applying noise reduction to those areas by increasing the contrast. It's kind of a micro contrast slider, actually. Then we have color noise reduction. There is no color noise in this image. Color noise is you'll often get, especially in darker areas of the image, you'll get these red, green, or blue dots. And if you do, you could open up the expose triangle there and move that slider to the right. And then you'll have a detail slider to help you bring back or rescue any detail you might have obliterated by moving that slider to the right. And then if it looks like it's not super smooth, it's a little choppy, you can move the smoothest slider to the right, or maybe you want it choppy, move it to the left. So those three sliders there, but as I mentioned, there's no color noise in this image. Now we already did optics, and I'm going to save geometry for a future episode because there really isn't any thing to be concerned with here as far as buildings falling backwards or distorted or anything like that because of a wide angle lens. So let's do a before after, and to do that you'd hit the backslash key on your keyboard. There's the before and there's the after. Before, after. Now it is, to me, still a little dark, so jump around. I'll go back up to light here. Now I have shadows all the way open. I could come in here and move exposure. But really what I want to do is I want the shadows just a little brighter, and I don't want my highlights brighter. I'd like those to stay a little bit darker. See, I got some very bright highlights up in here, so I don't want those any brighter. So what I'll do is I'll go back to this tone curve, and there are different tone curves here. We have the point curve, and then if you hover over this right here, it's the, I always forget, the parametric curve. I always forget that word for some reason. And with this, I could come in here with these sliders, and I could move them about to better affect the section I want to affect. For example, I want to come in here and do that, the shadows, right? So I'll go down here and push it up, and you can see because I moved this to left, it's only doing the very darkest shadows. If that made sense. Let me try to explain better. See how I move that now? See how it's kind of affecting everything? But I could come and I just wanted to brighten up those darkest shadows right there. And I think that looks pretty good. So going into the shadow section of the tone curve and pushing it up, I'm going to make the shadows brighter. Now, how much of the shadows? Do I want just the blacks brighter? Or as I move it to the right, I'll start moving in more into the midtones and making the midtones brighter. So I'm just going to do it right about there. I think that looks pretty good. So let's do a before after now. There's before and there's after. And we have some tools over here on the right. I'm just going to touch on one right now. We have this crop tool. You can see it's slightly crooked. The horizon's just slightly leaning left. So we'll go up here to the crop tool, and I'm just going to eyeball it. I'm going to come off the image, and my cursor turns into this double arrow, and I'll click down. I'm just going to drag down till it's got a nice straight horizon. And when I'm done, I'll just close down the crop tool, and there's my image. Totally finished. And that's really the power of Lightroom CC. You really could go from this to this. And I'm sorry if I sounded distracted since I've been adjusting the tone curve. We just got a kitten and he decided to jump on my desk and he's playing with my pen while I'm trying to talk. So that is why I sound distracted. I apologize for that. And he apologizes for being a bad kitten. But other than that, in our next episode, I'm going to get in a little more detail in processing, and we're going to talk about some more of these tools, the healing brush, the linear gradient, and the radial gradient. We'll talk about that in our next episode. Thank you, everyone, for watching my video series, Learn Lightroom CC. If you could do me a favor and like and share the video and subscribe to my YouTube channel, I'd really appreciate that as well. Also, in the description below this video will be a link to my website. Come visit my website, onlinephotographytraining.com. There you'll find all kinds of free photography how-to articles and videos. I'll talk to you guys soon.